The challenge. Sarah Martinez stood at the edge of the training compound, her boots crunching against the gravel as she watched 4 elite commandos emerge from the briefing room. Their confident swagger and dismissive glances told her everything she needed to know about what had just transpired inside. The morning sun cast long shadows across the facility, but the chill in the air had nothing to do with the weather. Captain Jake Morrison, the lead instructor, approached her with a clipboard in hand and reluctance written across his face. Behind him, the 4 commandos whispered among themselves, their voices carrying just enough for Sarah to catch fragments of their conversation. "She's supposed to be some kind of legend," one of them scoffed, adjusting his tactical vest. "Looks like any other desk jockey to me," another added with a smirk. Sarah had heard it all before. At 32, she had spent the last 8 years proving herself in situations where failure meant death. Her record spoke volumes, but apparently records meant little to men who had never served alongside her. The Navy SEAL insignia on her uniform felt heavier today than it had in months. Morrison cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to say. "Sarah, there's been a development. Command received some feedback about your recent assignment recommendation." She raised an eyebrow, her expression remaining neutral despite the fire building in her chest. "What kind of feedback?" "Captain, some concerns were raised about combat readiness and practical application of skills in high-stress environments." Morrison's words came out carefully measured, as if he was reading from a script. "The recommendation is for a practical assessment." The 4 commandos had stopped their chatter and were now openly staring. Sarah recognized them from their files. Delta Force operators, each with impressive combat records and egos to match. They had been brought in as part of a joint training exercise, but now it seemed they had volunteered for something else entirely. Sergeant First Class Marcus Chen, the apparent leader of the group, stepped forward. His arms crossed over his chest as he sized up Sarah with calculating eyes. "Ma'am, we're not trying to be disrespectful, but some of us have concerns about operational compatibility." Sarah's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. "Operational compatibility? Combat scenarios require split-second decisions and absolute trust between team members," Chen continued, his tone professional but condescending. "We need to know that every member of the team can handle themselves when things go sideways." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a grenade. Sarah had faced down terrorists in Afghanistan, led rescue operations in hostile territory, and earned her SEAL designation through the same grueling training that had broken countless men. Yet here she stood, having to justify her existence to 4 soldiers who had never bled alongside her. Morrison looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Perhaps we could arrange a standard evaluation." "No," Sarah interrupted, her voice cutting through the morning air with surgical precision. "If there are questions about my abilities, let's settle them right here, right now." Chen's eyebrows rose slightly, and he exchanged glances with his teammates. Corporal David Torres, a stocky man with scarred knuckles, stepped forward. "What exactly are you suggesting, ma'am?" Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. She could feel the weight of every female service member who had come before her, and every one who would come after. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about proving that skill, training, and determination weren't limited by gender. "A practical demonstration," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Combat simulation, non-lethal engagement. If you have questions about my capabilities, let's put them to rest." The 4th member of the group, Staff Sergeant Alex Rodriguez, let out a low whistle. "You're talking about taking on all 4 of us?" "I'm talking about proving a point," Sarah replied, meeting each of their gazes in turn. "Unless you're not confident in your own abilities?" The challenge hit its mark. Chen's professional demeanor cracked slightly, revealing the competitive fire underneath. These were elite soldiers, men accustomed to being the best at what they did. The suggestion that they might not be able to handle a single opponent, regardless of gender, struck at the core of their identity. Morrison held up a hand, sensing the escalating tension. "Now hold on. Let's think about this rationally." "The captain's right," Chen said, but his eyes never left Sarah's. "This could get complicated. Command wouldn't appreciate—" "Command wants to know if I'm combat ready," Sarah interrupted. "This seems like the most direct way to find out." Torres cracked his knuckles, the sound echoing across the compound. "Rules of engagement?" Sarah considered the question carefully. She needed to make this count, but she also needed to ensure that whatever happened here today would be viewed as legitimate by anyone who mattered. Non-lethal takedowns only. First to neutralize all opponents wins. Standard training weapons and equipment. The third commando, Corporal James Walker, had been silent throughout the exchange, but now he spoke up. "Time limit?" 2 minutes, Sarah said without hesitation. The number felt right. Long enough to be realistic. Short enough to prevent this from becoming a prolonged engagement that could result in serious injury. Rodriguez laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. 2 minutes? Against all 4 of us? "Unless that's not enough time for you to prove your point," Sarah replied, her tone perfectly level. The psychological warfare was subtle but effective. By framing their doubt as a limitation rather than hers, she had shifted the dynamic of the conversation. Now they weren't just questioning her abilities, they were being forced to defend their own. Chen looked to his teammates, and Sarah could see the silent communication passing between them. These men had worked together for years, developing the kind of nonverbal coordination that kept soldiers alive in combat zones. They were confident in their abilities, perhaps overconfident. Morrison made one last attempt at intervention. "I really think we should discuss this with—" "No need," Chen said, his decision made. "If this is what it takes to settle the question, then let's settle it." He turned to Sarah with something approaching respect. "You've got guts. I'll give you that." Sarah nodded, accepting the compliment for what it was worth. Guts alone wouldn't be enough for what she was about to attempt. She would need every piece of training, every hard-learned lesson, and every advantage she could create for herself. The training facility offered several options for combat simulations, but Sarah suggested the urban warfare mock-up. The environment would provide cover and opportunities for misdirection, elements that might help level the playing field against superior numbers. As they walked toward the simulation area, Sarah's mind shifted into a different mode. The doubt and frustration of the morning began to crystallize into something more useful: focused determination. She began cataloging everything she knew about her opponents. Chen was the leader, methodical and careful. He would likely try to coordinate the others, making him a priority target. Torres was aggressive and physical, probably used to overwhelming opponents through brute force. Walker had been observing more than talking, suggesting a tactical mindset that could be dangerous if left unchecked. Rodriguez seemed confident to the point of cockiness, which could be exploited. The mock urban environment consisted of several concrete structures designed to simulate city fighting conditions. Narrow alleys, doorways, and elevated positions created a complex three-dimensional battlefield. Sarah had trained in this environment hundreds of times, but never under these circumstances. Morrison would serve as the official observer, ensuring that safety protocols were followed and making the final determination about neutralizations. His presence added legitimacy to the exercise, even as Sarah could see his continued discomfort with the entire situation. The weapons provided were standard training gear, modified firearms that fired marking rounds, tactical knives dulled for safety, and protective equipment that would register impacts without causing serious injury. Each participant would wear sensors that would accurately record hits and determine when someone had been effectively neutralized. As Sarah checked her equipment, she became aware of a small crowd gathering at the observation area. Word had spread quickly through the facility, and other personnel were arriving to witness what was already being called the most unusual training exercise in recent memory. The pressure was mounting, but Sarah found herself oddly calm. This was what she had trained for, even if she had never imagined applying those skills in quite this way. Every drill, every exercise, every moment of preparation had been leading to something like this. Chen finished his equipment check and approached her one final time. "Last chance to reconsider," he said, but his tone suggested he hoped she wouldn't take the offer. Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Are you reconsidering?" He smiled then, the first genuine expression she had seen from him all morning. "Not a chance." Morrison's voice crackled over the communication system, explaining the rules one final time and establishing the boundaries of the engagement area. Sarah found her starting position at one end of the mock urban environment, while the 4 commandos took positions at the other end. The facility fell silent, except for the hum of electronic equipment and the distant sound of other training exercises. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself the way her instructors had taught her years ago. When she opened them again, her vision was sharp and her mind clear. Morrison's voice cut through the silence. "Simulation begins in 10 seconds. Sarah's heart rate slowed rather than accelerated, a response that had taken years to develop. Her breathing became deep and controlled. Around her, the environment seemed to take on a hyper-real quality, every shadow and angle becoming significant. 5 seconds. She could feel rather than see the 4 commandos preparing themselves. Their confidence was palpable, but so was their expectation of an easy victory. That expectation would be her first weapon. "Begin!" The word echoed across the compound as Sarah Martinez disappeared into the maze of concrete and steel, beginning what would become the most talked-about 80 seconds in the facility's history. Behind her, 4 elite commandos began their pursuit, unaware that they were about to learn a lesson about assumptions, skill, and the dangerous combination of underestimation and overconfidence. The challenge had been issued and accepted. Now, it was time to prove it. The hunt begins. The first 20 seconds would determine everything. Sarah knew that the 4 commandos would attempt to establish a coordinated search pattern, using their superior numbers to corner her systematically. She had to disrupt their plan before they could implement it. Moving with practiced silence, Sarah slipped through a narrow gap between 2 concrete walls that the others might struggle to navigate quickly. Her smaller frame, often seen as a disadvantage, now became a tactical asset. She could hear their boots on the concrete behind her, heavy and confident. Chen's voice carried across the compound, low but clear. "Standard sweep pattern. Rodriguez, take the north corridor. Walker, circle around south. Torres, straight through the middle. I'll coordinate from the central position." Sarah smiled grimly. Exactly what she had expected. Military training was thorough and effective, but it could also be predictable. These men were implementing textbook tactics for hunting a single target in an urban environment. Unfortunately for them, she had helped write some of those textbooks. She reached a junction where 3 paths converged and pressed herself against the wall. Through a gap in the concrete, she could see Rodriguez moving down the north corridor with professional efficiency. His weapon was raised and ready, his movements indicating years of combat experience. But experience could be a double-edged sword. Rodriguez expected resistance. He was prepared for a firefight, for an opponent who would engage him directly or attempt to hide until cornered. He wasn't prepared for what Sarah had planned. She waited until he passed her hiding spot, then emerged silently behind him. Her approach was so quiet that Rodriguez had no warning until Sarah's arms snaked around his throat in a perfectly executed sleeper hold. The technique, known in military circles as a blood choke, cut off blood flow to the brain rather than air to the lungs. Rodriguez was strong and well-trained, but the angle of attack and Sarah's precise application of pressure gave him no leverage to escape. He struggled for perhaps 8 seconds before the sensors on his gear registered the successful neutralization. His body went limp as the training equipment simulated the effects of unconsciousness. One down. Sarah eased Rodriguez to the ground carefully, ensuring he wouldn't be injured, then immediately moved to her next position. The element of surprise was now partially lost, but she had reduced the odds from 4-1 to 3-1. Chen's voice came over their communication system. "Rodriguez, report." Silence. "Rodriguez, respond." More silence. Sarah could hear the concern growing in Chen's voice. The loss of one team member so quickly had disrupted their careful plan. "Walker, circle back and check on Rodriguez. Torres, maintain your position. Something's wrong." Sarah had anticipated this response. The team would contract, becoming more cautious and defensive. This would slow their advance, but make them more dangerous when she did encounter them. She needed to capitalize on their confusion before they could adapt. She moved through the maze of concrete structures with practiced efficiency, her route taking her in a wide circle around Torres's last known position. The mock urban environment had been designed to simulate the chaotic nature of real city fighting, and Sarah used every piece of cover available. Through a gap in the wall, she spotted Walker moving carefully back toward Rodriguez's position. The commando was exhibiting excellent tactical awareness, checking corners and maintaining proper spacing, but his route was predictable, following the same path Rodriguez had taken. Sarah climbed onto a low concrete platform that provided elevation over Walker's approach route. The position was risky because it would expose her if Chen or Torres happened to look in her direction, but it offered the perfect angle for what she had in mind. Walker moved beneath her position, his attention focused on the potential threats at ground level. Urban warfare training emphasized the importance of checking elevated positions, but the human brain had limitations. It was difficult to maintain complete situational awareness in all directions simultaneously. Sarah dropped from the platform in perfect silence, landing directly behind Walker. This time, she didn't attempt a sleeper hold. Instead, she struck specific pressure points on his neck and shoulder with calculated precision. The techniques, derived from martial arts training and military combatives, temporarily disrupted nerve function and caused Walker's legs to buckle. As Walker fell, Sarah smoothly transitioned to a submission hold that immobilized his arms while positioning herself to avoid any counterattacks. The entire engagement lasted less than 15 seconds from initial contact to the sensors registering Walker's neutralization. 2 down. But now the real challenge would begin. Chen's voice over the communication system was noticeably sharper. "Walker, respond. Torres, we have a problem. Converge on the central position." Sarah heard the change in Chen's tone and knew that her window of easy opportunities was closing. The remaining 2 commandos would be much more cautious now, and they would likely stick together rather than risk being picked off individually. She needed to change tactics. The element of surprise was largely exhausted, and engaging too alert. Experienced soldiers simultaneously would require a different approach. Sarah began moving toward the central area of the mock urban environment, where she knew Chen would be trying to reestablish control of the situation. The central position was a raised concrete platform surrounded by multiple approach routes. It offered excellent visibility and fields of fire, making it a strong defensive position. Chen had chosen it well, but every strong position also had weaknesses. Sarah reached a point where she could observe the central platform without exposing herself. Chen was there, as expected, but Torres was not visible. That meant Torres was likely moving to join Chen, but she couldn't be sure of his exact position. This was the moment when Sarah's training truly mattered. She had spent years learning to make split-second decisions with incomplete information, weighing risks and opportunities in life-or-death situations. The skills that had kept her alive in Afghanistan would serve her well here. She decided to take a calculated risk. Rather than wait for Torres to reach Chen's position, she would attack while they were still separated. But this attack would need to be different from her previous engagements. Sarah moved to a position that would allow her to approach the central platform from an unexpected angle. The route was exposed and dangerous, but it would bring her within striking distance of Chen before he could effectively respond. As she prepared to move, Torres came into view, approaching Chen's position from the opposite direction. The timing was not ideal, but Sarah couldn't afford to wait. In 30 seconds, Torres would reach Chen, and her opportunity would be lost. She made her move. Sarah sprinted across the open ground between her cover and the central platform, her approach calculated to put Chen between herself and Torres. Chen spotted her immediately and began to turn his weapon toward her, but Sarah was already diving into a combat role that carried her behind a concrete barrier. Chen's training rounds sparked off the concrete where Sarah had been a moment before. His accuracy was impressive, but Sarah had expected no less from an elite soldier. She used the momentum of her role to come up in a firing position of her own. The exchange of training rounds lasted only seconds, but it felt like minutes to the observers watching from the sidelines. Sarah and Chen moved with the fluid precision of masters, each seeking an advantage while denying opportunities to their opponent. Sarah's smaller profile and agility allowed her to use the concrete barriers more effectively than Chen, who was forced to expose more of himself to maintain sight lines. But Chen's experience and tactical awareness made him a formidable opponent, even at a disadvantage. The engagement might have continued indefinitely, but Torres arrived and immediately began trying to flank Sarah's position. Now she was facing two opponents with overlapping fields of fire and the ability to coordinate their attacks. Sarah made a decision that went against every instinct she had developed through years of training. Instead of seeking better cover or attempting to escape, she moved toward her opponents. The aggressive maneuver caught both men off guard. In their experience, a single operative facing superior numbers would attempt to create distance and use cover to even the odds. Sarah's charge directly into their position violated their expectations so completely that their response was delayed by crucial milliseconds. She reached Torres first, tackling him around the waist and using his own momentum against him. They went down together, but Sarah controlled the fall, ensuring that Torres landed hard while she remained on top and in control. Chen tried to get a clear shot, but Sarah and Torres were too entangled for him to fire without risking hitting his teammate. He began moving to get a better angle, but Sarah was already implementing the next phase of her plan. Using Torres as a shield, Sarah maneuvered toward Chen while maintaining control of her immediate opponent. Torres struggled beneath her, but her positioning gave him no leverage to escape or bring his own weapon to bear. When Chen tried to circle for a clear shot, Sarah used Torres's body weight to pivot, keeping the struggling commando between herself and Chen's weapon. The maneuver required precise timing and exceptional body control, skills that had taken years to develop. Chen realized that he was effectively neutralized as long as Sarah maintained her hold on Torres. His only option was to close the distance and engage in hand-to-hand combat, where his size and strength advantages might overcome Sarah's positioning. He made that choice, dropping his weapon and charging toward the entangled pair. It was exactly what Sarah had been waiting for. As Chen reached them, Sarah released Torres and rolled away, leaving both men momentarily off balance and in each other's way. In the split second of confusion that followed, Sarah struck. Her first target was Chen, who was still recovering from his charge. A precisely placed strike to his solar plexus doubled him over, and a follow-up blow to the back of his neck triggered his neutralization sensors. 3 down. Torres was getting back to his feet, reaching for his weapon. Sarah dove toward him, tackling him again before he could fully recover. This time, the engagement was brief. Torres was strong and skilled, but he was also frustrated and angry at being used as a human shield. His emotions compromised his technique just enough for Sarah to gain the advantage she needed. A submission hold, properly applied, ended the simulation. 4 down. Morrison's voice echoed across the training facility. Time: 1 minute and 18 seconds. All targets neutralized. Exercise complete. Silence followed the announcement. Sarah stood slowly, helping Torres to his feet, with a professionalism that impressed even her former opponents. Around the observation area, the gathered personnel stared in stunned quiet. Chen was the first to speak, his voice carrying a note of genuine respect that had been completely absent earlier. That was unexpected. Sarah nodded, accepting the acknowledgement. Unexpected can be an advantage. Torres rubbed his neck where Sarah's final hold had been applied. Where did you learn to fight like that? The same places you learned to fight, Sarah replied. I just had different teachers. Walker, who had recovered from his earlier neutralization, shook his head in amazement. I've never seen anyone use positioning like that. The way you turned our numerical advantage against us. Numbers only matter if you can use them effectively, Sarah said. Once you're fighting individually instead of as a team, the odds change. Rodriguez arrived, having recovered from his encounter with Sarah's sleeper hold. I never saw you coming. How did you move so quietly? Sarah smiled. Practice. Lots and lots of practice. Morrison approached the group, his earlier discomfort replaced by something approaching awe. I've been running training exercises for 15 years and I've never seen anything like that. The crowd of observers began to disperse, but Sarah could hear fragments of their conversations. Words like incredible and unbelievable drifted across the compound. She had proven her point, but she knew that this was just the beginning. The aftermath. The debriefing room felt different than it had that morning. The same concrete walls, the same fluorescent lighting, the same metal table and chairs, but the atmosphere had completely changed. The 4 commandos who had questioned Sarah's abilities now sat with a mixture of respect and curiosity written across their faces. Colonel Patricia Hayes, the base commander, had arrived shortly after the exercise concluded. Word of the unusual training demonstration had reached her office within minutes, and she had come to see for herself what had caused such a stir among her personnel. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Colonel Hayes said, reviewing the official report Morrison had prepared. 4 elite special operations personnel challenged the combat readiness of 1 Navy SEAL, and that SEAL neutralized all 4 opponents in under 80 seconds? 78 seconds, to be precise, Morrison clarified, still seeming somewhat stunned by what he had witnessed. Colonel Hayes turned her attention to Sarah, who sat at attention despite the informal nature of the gathering. Petty Officer Martinez, would you walk me through your tactical thinking during the exercise? Sarah had been expecting this question and had used the time since the exercise to organize her thoughts. Ma'am, the key was recognizing that traditional tactics wouldn't work against superior numbers. I needed to prevent them from operating as a coordinated unit. Chen leaned forward in his chair. The way you isolated each of us individually was brilliant. By the time we realized what was happening, you had already cut our effective strength in half. The psychological aspect was just as important as the physical tactics, Sarah continued. You were expecting a certain type of engagement, and I needed to disrupt those expectations. Torres nodded slowly. When you charged at us instead of seeking cover, it completely threw off our response pattern. We were trained to handle someone trying to escape or find a defensive position, not someone attacking directly into a superior force. Walker had been quiet since the exercise, but now he spoke up. I keep thinking about how you used our own training against us. We followed doctrine perfectly, but somehow that made us predictable. Colonel Hayes made notes as she listened. This raises some interesting questions about our current training methodologies. If one person can neutralize 4 elite operators by exploiting predictable patterns, what does that say about our tactical education? Rodriguez had been studying Sarah intently. Ma'am, with respect, I don't think this was just about exploiting patterns. The level of skill required to execute what we just saw, that's not something you develop overnight. Rodriguez is right, Sarah said. This wasn't about superior tactics defeating superior numbers. It was about preparation meeting opportunity. I've spent years training for scenarios where I might be outnumbered and outgunned. Morrison looked up from his own notes. The precision of your movements, the timing, the way you transitioned between different combat techniques. How long have you been developing these specific skills? Sarah considered the question carefully. It's hard to say exactly. Some of the techniques I use today I learned in basic SEAL training. Others came from specialized combat courses, martial arts instruction, and real-world experience. But putting them together in this particular way, that was something I developed during my deployments. Chen's expression had shifted from respect to genuine curiosity. Real-world experience. You mean you've actually used these tactics in combat? 3 times, Sarah replied matter-of-factly. Twice in Afghanistan and once during a hostage rescue operation in Syria. Each time I was separated from my unit and had to deal with multiple hostiles alone. The room fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. These weren't theoretical techniques developed in a training environment. They were battle-tested methods that had kept her alive in actual combat situations. Colonel Hayes set down her pen and fixed Sarah with a direct stare. Tell me about Syria. Sarah took a deep breath, organizing memories she rarely discussed. We were extracting a captured journalist from a compound outside Aleppo. The intelligence was wrong about the number of hostiles present. During the extraction, an explosion separated me from my team. I found myself alone with the journalist, surrounded by 4 armed guards who were trying to prevent our escape. Torres whistled low. 4 against 1, with a civilian to protect. The stakes were different then, Sarah said. If I failed, both the journalist and I would have been killed or captured. That kind of motivation has a way of focusing your thinking. Walker shook his head in amazement. And you neutralized all 4 guards? The situation was different from today's exercise, Sarah explained. Real weapons, real stakes, an environment that wasn't designed for training. But the fundamental principles were the same. Isolate opponents, exploit their expectations, use their coordination against them. Colonel Hayes had been taking detailed notes throughout Sarah's explanation. The questioning of your combat readiness seems rather ironic in this context. Chen had the grace to look embarrassed. Ma'am, we had no knowledge of Petty Officer Martinez's operational history. The concerns that were raised came from personnel who had never worked with her directly. What kind of concerns, specifically? Colonel Hayes asked. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in his seat. There were questions about physical capability, combat effectiveness under stress, unit cohesion in mixed-gender teams. Standard concerns that get raised whenever integration policies are discussed. Sarah felt a familiar flash of anger, but she kept her voice level. Colonel, I've been dealing with those same concerns for 8 years. This exercise wasn't really about proving my individual capabilities. It was about challenging assumptions that some people make based on factors that have nothing to do with combat effectiveness. Colonel Hayes nodded thoughtfully. And what conclusions have you drawn from today's demonstration? Torres answered before Sarah could respond. That our assumptions were not only wrong, but dangerously wrong. If we had encountered Petty Officer Martinez as an opponent instead of in a training exercise, our overconfidence could have gotten us killed. Walker agreed. The techniques she used weren't just effective against us because we underestimated her. They were effective because they were superior tactics executed with exceptional skill. Sarah appreciated their acknowledgement. but she knew that the broader issues hadn't been resolved. Respect earned through demonstration is valuable, but it shouldn't be necessary. Every female service member shouldn't have to prove herself through extraordinary means just to be accepted as competent. Chen looked directly at Sarah. You're right. But what happened here today goes beyond gender issues. What you demonstrated was world-class combat capability. That would be impressive regardless of who was demonstrating it. Colonel Hayes had been listening to the exchange with growing interest. Petty Officer Martinez, have you ever considered instructional duty? The question caught Sarah off guard. Ma'am, the tactical innovations you demonstrated today represent a significant advancement in close-quarters combat doctrine. The military would benefit from incorporating these techniques into our training programs. Morrison looked up sharply. Colonel, are you suggesting that Petty Officer Martinez develop a new curriculum based on today's exercise? I'm suggesting that someone with her combination of real-world experience and demonstrable skill could revolutionize how we prepare our special operations personnel for certain types of engagements. Sarah felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. Teaching had always appealed to her, but she had never considered that her combat experience might be valuable in an instructional context. Torres leaned back in his chair. I'd sign up for that course in a heartbeat. What we experienced today showed me that there are still things I can learn about combat. Rodriguez nodded agreement. The way you broke down our coordination and turned our numbers against us, that's not covered in any manual I've read. Walker was more thoughtful. It's not just about the specific techniques. It's about thinking differently about tactical problems. Most of our training focuses on overwhelming force and superior firepower. What if you don't have those advantages? Sarah found herself warming to the idea. There are entire categories of combat scenarios that our current training doesn't address adequately. What do you do when you're outnumbered? How do you fight effectively when you can't rely on backup? How do you turn disadvantages into advantages? Colonel Hayes made another note. These are exactly the kinds of questions that our training program should be addressing. Modern warfare often puts small units or even individual operators in situations where traditional tactical doctrine isn't sufficient. Chen had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up. Ma'am, there's another aspect to this that we should consider. The psychological impact of what happened today will spread throughout the special operations community. People are going to want to understand how one person neutralized 4 elite operators. That could be valuable in itself, Morrison observed, if it gets people thinking more critically about their assumptions and tactical limitations. Sarah realized that the morning's challenge had evolved into something much larger than she had intended. What began as a simple demonstration of capability had become a catalyst for broader discussions about training, tactics, and the nature of combat effectiveness. Colonel Hayes stood, signaling the end of the formal debriefing. Petty Officer Martinez, I want you to prepare a detailed after-action report on today's exercise. Include your tactical reasoning, the specific techniques you employed, and your recommendations for how these methods might be incorporated into existing training programs. Yes, ma'am, Sarah replied. Gentlemen, Colonel Hayes addressed the 4 commandos, I want similar reports from each of you, focusing on what you learned from this experience and how it might change your approach to future operations. As the group began to disperse, Chen approached Sarah. I owe you an apology. We questioned your abilities based on preconceptions rather than evidence. That was unprofessional and unfair. Sarah extended her hand. Apology accepted. But more importantly, you acknowledged your mistake and learned from it. That's what good soldiers do. Torres joined them. I've been thinking about what you said regarding using our coordination against us. How did you know we would follow standard search patterns? Because that's what you were trained to do, Sarah replied. Military training is designed to create predictable, effective responses to common situations. But predictability can be exploited if your opponent understands your training as well as you do. Walker and Rodriguez had overheard the conversation and moved closer. So, the solution is to train more variably? Rodriguez asked. Partly, Sarah said. But it's also about developing the ability to recognize when standard approaches won't work and having alternatives ready. Flexibility and adaptability are just as important as tactical proficiency. Morrison approached the group. Sarah, I have to ask. When you issued the challenge this morning, did you know you could do what you just did? Sarah considered the question honestly. I knew I had the skills and experience to have a chance. But combat is unpredictable, even in training scenarios. There were a dozen ways it could have gone wrong. But you were confident enough to stake your reputation on it, Chen observed. Sometimes you have to be willing to bet on yourself, Sarah replied, especially when the alternative is accepting limitations that others want to impose on you. As the group prepared to leave the debriefing room, Colonel Hayes pulled Sarah aside. I meant what I said about instructional duty. The military needs more people who can think outside conventional parameters while maintaining operational effectiveness. I'll consider it seriously, ma'am, Sarah said. Good. But first, finish that after-action report. I have a feeling it's going to be required reading for a lot of people. As Sarah left the debriefing room, she reflected on the events of the day. She had set out to prove a point about her individual capabilities, but the exercise had revealed something larger about the nature of combat, training, and the assumptions that could limit even the most skilled operators. The challenge of Prove It seal had been met, but Sarah realized that the real work was just beginning. Changing minds and advancing techniques would require more than a single demonstration, no matter how impressive. But today had been a start, and sometimes that's all you need to begin changing the world.